Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And I'm not even going to try whether to say good morning, good evening, good afternoon, because some of you it's tomorrow, some of you it's still today. It's evening in the States. It's morning for me. It's evening. I'm getting all confused today. But we are in the middle of Australia in World War II week, which I have to say has been one of my most enjoyable segments of programming for some time, just because I'm like a sponge for this information. Philip Bradley yesterday was brilliant. Carl James was brilliant. I've been enjoying it. And I'm really looking forward to today's show. So, there are a number of books that we know of that follow one unit through World War II, notably Stephen Ambrose's Band of Brothers, but also James Holland's new book, Brothers in Arms, about the Sherwood Rangers in Normandy and on to the end of the war in Europe, doing incredibly well, regarded as one of his best works. There's something about following one unit through that gives a complete story, albeit from one point of view of one unit. So you don't necessarily get the broad sweeping strokes of a campaign, but you understand what one unit's experience was throughout. And when you're talking about units that served all the way through, this unit we're talking about today, my God, did some of them see a long war. Okay, by the end of the war, there were a lot of replacements, but we're talking 5 years in several continents, numerous campaigns. Men learning their job on the ground, in the field. Some of them didn't start out brilliant leaders. They ended up much better. And it's a fascinating story. And of all the books I've had to read for what I do now with World War II TV, I thoroughly enjoyed An Australian Band of Brothers. I mean, I couldn't put it down. I which was good for me because I read it in 4 days. Sometimes a book sits on my shelf and I end up reading 3 or 4 at the same time, but this one just tore through it because it was so good. So the author of that book, Mark Johnston, is something of a legend in Australia, incredible historian. He teaches history in Melbourne, Australia. He's spoken to school groups, military groups, renowned for what he does. So I'm delighted to have him today on the show. So good evening to you, Mark. How are you today?
Well, thanks, Paul, and thank you for that introduction.
Well, it's heartfelt, and I really did enjoy the book. And just before we get into the presentation, it's the end of the 11th of November there. So what was going on for you? Did you commemorate the events?
Yeah, so as you said, I'm a teacher. I'm a teacher at a school, Scotch College in Melbourne, which is a famous school which produced many soldiers, including John Monash, Australia's greatest soldier, probably. So we had a special assembly with a discussion of the contribution of old boys of the school to the wars and the losses. There were hundreds. There were about 300 in the Second World War who died.
Wow.
And a minute's silence and last post and so on. It's very moving.
I'm gonna, as soon as this is over, and I'm gonna go off and do something in the cemetery just up the road from me and have my little private thought. And it's interesting. We could do a whole segment on how remembrance has changed over the years, but to me, it's always about what feels right for me personally. And I'll probably go and do my own private thing, and that's just me. But it is interesting we are doing this in the middle of Remembrance Week because it does bring those extra people looking at the sacrifice of generations that perhaps don't think about it the rest of the year. I mean, for me, it's a 365-day a year thinking about the war and the results of it. But some people, it's kind of an annual thing, or they do it on Memorial Day or D-Day or whatever it would be. But it brings extra people in there. But anyway, your book. So we'll talk about who the unit are as we go through the presentation, of course. But the difficulty with writing about one unit is having enough information to draw on, because some of the units, whether they're British, American, or whatever, the war diaries can be a little bit thin. So fleshing out that to make one book, you need that personal testimony, and you need it written pretty close to the events, because as we know, the older people get, the more things get a little bit mixed up. So tell us a little bit about how this book came about and the source material for it.
Yeah, so I've been writing about Australians in the Second World War since 1988, when I was doing a thesis about Australian soldiers and their experience in the war. And at that time, I sent letters to newspapers all over Australia, 250 plus newspapers, asking veterans or their descendants to get in touch with me and lend me any writings of their relatives or of their own, letters and memoirs and diaries and the sort. And 3 veterans who lent me their memoirs or diaries or letters were all part of the same company, Don Company of the 2nd 43rd Battalion. And in each case, their writings were especially detailed, and they were sort of disarmingly honest in some places as well. And I used those among hundreds of other sources that I got for many years. And didn't put them together in any way until 2014, when, partly inspired by seeing Band of Brothers, I think for the second or third time on TV, I decided I could use those sources to tell the story of their company. I was very lucky too, Paul, in the course of the project, I came across some other wonderful testimonies by individual soldiers. There was a little bit of detective work involved, but also some luck. In particular, a soldier who, when he started his diary, was a sergeant. He ended up a lieutenant and won a military cross. So his name was Lindsay Thomas, and he kept a diary throughout the desert campaigns until he was wounded, and that was the end of his war. But also a memoir by another officer called George Lush, a very articulate man who became a judge after the war, and he wrote another disarmingly honest account of his experiences with some very confronting things in it about leadership and about the battalion that these other three men were in.
And I think I was saying to you before we went live there that it was the slightly contrasting opinions they had about some of the same individuals that I found really refreshing, and honest I think is the word there, because you do sometimes get if it's veterans who've been meeting at reunions every year, they start to sing from the same hymn sheet because they've all got through the war, and even if they didn't perhaps particularly like some guy during the war, they're now part of this body of people who meet up, and so they maybe sort of censor their views a little bit, and they start singing in agreement as they interviewed. There was some real kind of not conflict, but difference of opinion, and you can see as you read the book, people are reaching their leadership peaks at different times, and of course, as people like S.L.A. Marshall said in the States, no matter how good you are, if you've been in combat for a long time, you do eventually hit some kind of wall, and even the best commander can have a wobble, have a moment there. And it seems that over the course of this length of service this unit did, they're hitting these walls at different times, they're reaching their peaks at different times, and it meant that an individual's perception of another individual could be a little bit not flawed, but they were at different stages of their progression, and I found that really intriguing. So it must have been kind of, because you try and pull out what you think is the closest version of this to the truth, with that weird thing in history that what is the truth about any event, given that it's individual opinions and they are subjective. But you do offer these different alternative views of people, and I found that really fascinating. So was it difficult to write? You've written quite a few books. Was it easier or difficult? Where does it sit on the chart of ease of writing?
That's a great question. I think it was fairly easy in one sense. They're all members of the 9th Division, and I've written several books about the 9th Division I had before, and one about Alamein with a good friend of mine, Peter Stanley, and of course Alamein's quite central to it. So it's quite easy in some senses. As you know, I was writing it in part too as a tribute to those three men, and I didn't want to do anything to malign them. One interesting example of what you just said is there was an officer, his name was Eric Grant, and he was the commander of the platoon that's really central to the story, 18 Platoon. And at one point, one of the three main characters, John Lovegrove, and Grant really were at loggerheads, and Lovegrove thought that Grant had basically had a breakdown and should leave the unit. And this guy Lovegrove actually spoke up to the commanding officer about Grant's state of mind, and it got him into trouble. He just narrowly evaded a court-martial. But Grant was a good friend of one of the other three men, Gordon Coombe, who became an officer. And Grant and Coombe, there was no sense in any of Gordon's writings that Grant was a poor officer. And Grant fits in very much with the story you're just talking about, officers improving. Grant won a military cross later in a really heroic action at a place in New Guinea called Javanen.
I was muted. That's that thing that people's perceptions, and it can change. The fact that you have some people who are non-commons who become officers, I think, is very important as well, because once you become an officer, you see things very differently. Even if you've been a sergeant, you have been leading men. The level of responsibility when you get that commission ups the ante, ups the game when you realize the orders you're getting from on high, and the intelligence officer and the adjutant and the commanding officer all are giving this information, and it's your responsibility to put these things together. It can be quite a daunting task. We'll get into the presentation, but for those who are watching, as usual, folks, the link to purchase the book is in the description below. The link to Mark's website is in there about his other books, and there's already been some comments about Whispering Death, another great book by Mark. So please, that's all down there in the description. But yeah, we'll start the presentation. Mark has sent a whole lot of fantastic photos. So let's start with these three figures that are central to the book there. So let's start with Gordon.
Yeah, so Gordon was the best, had the highest level of education of the three. He'd completed high school and had just started university when the war began, and was working as a clerk at the Parliament of South Australia. All three of these men were from South Australia, as was their battalion, formed in South Australia. The X number he has means he's a volunteer, and the S means a volunteer in South Australia. He was a tall man, as you can see there, a very strong guy, an excellent sportsman. He excelled at cricket, in which he was a wicket keeper, and was always proud of the fact that he'd caught out Don Bradman in a game before the war. A very good soccer player as well. Soccer wasn't nearly as popular in Australia at the time as Australian rules football or rugby, but he represented Australia after the war in one soccer match against England. So really fine sportsman, very intelligent man, and he was more ambitious than the other two. He wanted to become an officer, but he had to rise through the ranks to do that. Shall I talk to Paul about what happens to him later in the war, or do you just want to talk about
whatever you want to talk about it? I mean, it's up to you. It's your call.
Yeah, so he proved really an outstanding soldier, won a military cross in New Guinea. One of the chapters of the book is about him going to OCTU, the Officer Cadet Training Unit in the Middle East, where he really struggled initially, and the British officers in charge, he felt, were quite prejudiced against him, but it ended up that his cricket skill helped him pass the course, he felt, because one of the officers who came in was a spin bowler, and Gordon was a brilliant wicketkeeper to his bowling. But as I say, he was a really fine soldier, and the other two felt he was a remarkably good officer when he came to them in Tobruk about 3/4 of the way through the siege. And he was wounded twice during the war, and by the end of the war, he was a captain adjutant of the battalion. So it's a remarkable sort of success story. We often think about, I think in Australia, we talk about our soldiers advancing through merit, to rising through the ranks, and he's just a perfect example of that.
Yeah, and the fact that most of these men are from South Australia, and you make the point of saying they're coming from different professions, and some are, and Australia had its depression and had its financial hardships like most of the world had in the 20s and 30s, and these people, some of them have been pre-war volunteers. They have some military experience, some it's an opportunity, but they are all volunteers. That is key to this, and that's what often some of these units that earn this reputation, it's because they are volunteers. There's something special about that, I think, certainly in the early war, of the mindset about people who volunteer, and despite their differences, there's that wish to do something for your country or for your empire, in Australia's case, it gets a little bit more convoluted because the threat initially was the other side of the world. We talked with Michael Veitch on Monday about the Australians who ended up fighting in other parts of the world were perceived differently from within Australia because of the pressing worries about invasion. This unit, as we know, are overseas all of the time. They're always away from their homeland, which was meant it difficult for them as well, because some of these guys are away for a long time from home. But we'll move on to John Lovegrove there.
Yeah, I should have mentioned too, you made the good point about some of them having pre-war service, and Gordon was the only one who didn't. The other two had been in the militia in Australia. So John Lovegrove was working as a clerk. He moved around various places in country, South Australia. He went to high school but didn't complete it, and he was very self-conscious about his lack of education when he sent me his diary and memoir. But as I said in the book, he said too in his letter, this is a warts and all account of my service, and it was really wonderful in that sense, the honesty about matters, not only including officers who he thought were inadequate, but also soldiers who collapsed under the strain of warfare on the front line. Some of them, the strain of being in action for too long, some of them going into action the first time. And he was very, as I say, he was honest about it, and also sympathetic to those men, even though he was as hard as nails himself. He was a brilliant patroller. In Tobruk, he went out on dozens of patrols and did an excellent job, and such a good job that he was asked to give lectures to officers back in Palestine once they'd come out of Tobruk. He was wounded at Alamein, and I think it was one of the best experiences of my life in talking to veterans like you. I've talked to many of them. When I met him in South Australia at a hotel where the 2nd 43rd Battalion was having a luncheon, and he told me of advancing at Alamein on the first night, bayonets attached to their rifles into the enemy lines in an attack which was not exactly a suicide mission, but a one where they knew they were going to take heavy losses. It was a diversionary attack, and I could just sense, I mean, the way he sort of moved my imagination into what it could have been like, you know, that going in there and knowing it was going to be hand-to-hand fighting. And he gave a marvelous account of that too in his memoir. He was a sergeant. He reached the rank of sergeant. He was told he was going to get a commission in the field in New Guinea. His officer recommended against that, and the whole idea of the commission in the field was dropped, and he was then wounded in action after being told that when they got back to Australia, he'd go into officer training, and that wound was so serious it ended his frontline service. So again, a really admirable soldier, a really fine soldier, and you know, as I say, it was a great pleasure to meet him and hear his account of his experiences.
Yeah, and again, I don't want to sound like some gushing fanboy, but that honesty that comes through in what he told you and wrote, and then you conveying it on the page, because it is so important to get that absolute honesty about what it was like, and that sometimes the missions do seem to be hopeless from your point of view, and there are people who are showing signs around you of fear and all the other emotions there. But sometimes when you're reading the more military dry accounts, all that gets kind of pushed out the way, and it always sounds a bit kind of boy's own adventure and a bit too formulated. And the British and Australian war diaries can be very dry in that regard. Yes. And there's never much sense of emotion and fear and trepidation. Oh, the O group met at 1000 hours. We set off on the patrol, and you think, I'm sure it wasn't like that. I'm sure it wasn't just like a cricket game. And that's what, when for those who are watching this, who perhaps are diving into Australian World War II history for the first time, this is a wonderful starting point to understand the mindset of your average young Australian, what they felt, because as much as the Australians, Americans, and British are fighting for the same cause, they're coming at it from very different angles. And you know, if you're fighting on the beaches of Dunkirk as a Brit, you are kind of feeling you're defending your own homeland. But if you're an Australian in Tobruk, it must have felt on the other side of the world. Same as Americans who are in early parts of Burma or whatever it would be. Everybody's experience, everybody's motivation is very different, and that's what I think is important to get across to people. But where's
Can I just make one more?
We missed Alan, didn't we? Yeah, we missed Alan there.
Yeah. I was going to say too, though, Paul, I think John's account is a corrective also to the idea that Australians in general, maybe soldiers in general, were all heroic, and they came through it, you know, chin up and so on. He talks very honestly about, as I say, people collapsing on the ground and what he had to do about it. And that happens in every army, of course, that there are soldiers who can't go on. And he talks, for example, about slapping people across the face, or even hitting them with a rifle, which astonished Alan Jones when I told him about that later. But yes, that's really quite confronting, the discussion of having to do that.
And so, and let's talk about Alan's. And I mean, again, not only were they three great accounts, three very different individuals.
Yes. So, you know, I'd say Gordon's politics were probably quite conservative, whereas Alan, when I met him in the 1980s, said he was a Fabian socialist and a pacifist, and his war experience had largely done that. So his job was motor painter before the war. So he was very much affected by the Depression, as were the other two, but very conscious of the disadvantage of people around him, you know, the economic disadvantage. I think he's probably the most reflective of the three writers. He wrote several books about his life, and his autobiography, which he tried to get published unsuccessfully before he met me, is really amazing. There's so much detail about, for example, Tobruk. It's sort of a day-by-day account. I never saw a diary that he'd written, but he must have kept notes and to have written in so much detail. And he also had many letters, dozens of letters that he sent to me to keep that he'd written home. So the letters and the memoir, they really work well together. As a soldier, he didn't sort of reach the heights of the other two in doing remarkable things that were rewarded, but he tended to be on the mortar. The 2-inch mortar was introduced to the unit, and he became very expert on it. So he used that in the that Alamein raid I was mentioning that John was in on the 23rd of October, the first night, and was able to see afterwards the results of the fire he'd done. Also in New Guinea, on one occasion, the occasion where John was wounded and Gordon already had been, even though he was only a corporal, Alan Jones took over the platoon that was fighting at Finchhafen, and he not only used the mortar in such a way that he was able to kill the commander of the Japanese who were attacking them in great numbers, but also led the unit in repelling the attack. So that was sort of his moment of glory. But as I say, he was a very astute observer about the unit and the army in general.
Brilliant stuff. And we just had a question there from Ernest Malley for you, saying that most of these men are post-Dunkirk volunteers, or deep thinkers as they were called. Does Mark know what had held them back from volunteering early and becoming 6th Division 39ers?
Well, that's a great question. The one that comes to mind straight away is Gordon Coombe, who was courting his future wife, and they were actually engaged. And I mentioned in the book some extracts from letters where he said to his wife, because they were in separate parts of South Australia at the time, I'm feeling this calling that I don't think I can resist for very long. But, you know, it took him a while to 1940 to do that. It should be mentioned, too, that it was only in 1940 that people really started joining in very large numbers. You know, that was surprising compared to 1914, how difficult it was to get men to join the 20,000 who were supposed to join at the start. So it was the fall of France, of course.
Yeah.
In the question that mentioned Dunkirk, that was a critical turning point that led many to decide they were going to give up their responsibilities at home and, you know, go and fight.
Which you, the Australia and New Zealand, have been doing repeatedly. Whenever the Empire needed you, or the former Empire needed you, always the first to sign up. And along with Canada, it's amazing. When one of the things that annoys me all the time is this idea of Britain being on its own in 1940, on our own with a massive, great empire. And maybe that empire was across the four corners of the globe, but the idea of us being on our own, it always frustrates me. Despite my patriotism, it's a nonsensical remark to make. Britain was part of a massive, great commonwealth of people who felt similarly. So let's squash that one there. But let's get in. Let's get to Tobruk, because obviously the book covers the training and the formation and all that side of things, but in a presentation like that we're going to skip kind of straight through to the exciting action. So they find themselves in North Africa, and we had North Africa Week on World War II a couple of weeks ago, and if people remember that, the North African campaign is kind of swinging back and forth over 2 years, and big highs and big lows. But the Australians found themselves, of course, as we know, at Tobruk. So let's talk about Don Company and how they ended up there and what their role was.
Yeah, so these men were part of the 9th Division, as I mentioned, which became the most famous division in the Australian Army. You know, it was really well known in the UK, for example, the story of what it had done at Tobruk and Alamein. But when it arrived in North Africa, that division had really only just been put together with many units that were originally slated for the earlier divisions. So some of the men didn't particularly want to be in the 9th Division, and it was poorly armed. It hadn't been fully trained. It was actually pretty lucky that it ended up in Tobruk. Most of the division was part of what they called the Benghazi handicap, running away from Rommel after he first arrived. But by the 11th of April, most of the division was in Tobruk, surrounded by Rommel, and that campaign ended up being the making of them. as in some ways it was the making of the Afrika Korps. It was good troops fighting each other. Don Company started off on the eastern part of the perimeter, up against Italians who formed most of the surrounding force. It was actually John and Alan were the only two there initially, because Gordon went to officer training. But they were involved in some fascinating sort of incidents, like a Stuka landed near their lines on one occasion, and they went out. Both of them went out, and they captured the crew, and Alan got the machine gun off the Stuka, and only for his officer then to say, "I'll have that." And so Alan only saw it months later when it was broken. But that was a fascinating story, because it was the first Germans they'd met face to face, and they were surprised to find they were just like they were, except they smelt better, was one of the comments with eau de cologne. So there was that pretty gentle introduction. They went to the southern part of the perimeter. Basically, all the units had a turn on all parts of the perimeter and being in reserve. But the place you can see in grey on the western part of Tobruk there was the one where the Germans came closest to breaking through on the 1st of May. They captured quite a few of the posts there. Tobruk was surrounded by Italian-built concrete posts. And the Australians just managed to sort of do some ad hoc posts in that area, which became known as the salient. So the lines were only a couple of hundred metres apart, or yards apart. And it was a really dangerous place to serve. You could not raise your head above the parapet during the day. You would be shot by snipers or a machine gun in the vicinity, machine guns on fixed lines and the like. So no place in Tobruk was safe. It's a bit like what's often said about Gallipoli for Australians in 1915. Nowhere in Gallipoli was safe. So it was with Tobruk. So one of the chapters in this book is actually called Tobruk, Rest in Peace, because when they're actually resting behind the lines, they suffered more casualties than they did anywhere except the salient.
And it really was. The book gets across. It's on the job training, isn't it? I mean, of course, they have been trained how to handle a rifle, how to shoot a rifle, how to march, how to do the very, very basics. But we're borrowing the Band of Brothers metaphor, and when we talk about E Company 506, they had effectively spent 2 years training before they saw any enemy, and so they had developed incredible ability to do unit attacks and defensive positions and flanking maneuvers. And when you're talking about this part of the war, 41, 42, whether you're Australian, British, or anybody else there is a lot of on-the-job training, because you haven't really had that grounding of just exactly what to do in combat, and because of the swiftness with which the Germans and Italians are bringing new techniques there to the play. Anything they had learned in Australia probably would have been out of date by the time they got in theatre anyway. So you see this progression in the book of a unit finding its feet, and they're not even kind of sure how to dig in at the beginning, are they? And what works and what doesn't work. And
that's right, and they're moving every few days. Yeah, with their equipment too. Sorry, Paul, I was just going to say, talking about their equipment, many of them had never thrown a live grenade. Many of them had never seen one in operation. They had no submachine guns at the start of the siege. They didn't arrive until May. The siege began in early April. Not many Bren guns. They hadn't seen many Bren guns either. This is a wonderful photo from a veteran of another unit that he sent me, taken from his private camera. Looking out, you can see the anti-tank ditch in the distance and a Vickers machine gun in the foreground.
Yeah, there's some brilliant photos there, and that's another stuff. A Braider there used a defensive position. I mean, again, there's a lot of improvisation of weapons, and the fact they're even, as you say, taking weapons off down the aircraft and things like that. And there's Italian trucks and things being used. It's a real hands-on theatre at that point of the war. When you get to Operation Torch later on, I think it's probably the first big Allied operation where units have had lots of training for it, and they've got perhaps fresher equipment and fresher ideas. But this period is really one of, as I said, I keep repeating myself, but on the job training and improvisation. But and you can see that some men are thriving on this, and others, as we said earlier, are taking their time to find their feet. And that learning curve is very apparent in the book, and very apparent in the writing of these three individuals. So what were the key things that they learned in this period? What were the foundations, the brilliance they were bring to the battles of El Alamein and New Guinea later? What do you think was the four key things they acquired in this early moment?
I think a critical thing was that Morsehead, General Leslie Morsehead, who was the commander of the fortress, determined from early on, he actually said to mention Dunkirk again, this will be no Dunkirk. We're going to besiege the besiegers. We're going to take the battle to them. And, Australians already had a fine reputation from the First World War for their patrolling. And that aggressive patrolling was really a hallmark of, all Australian units, but the 9th Division really learnt it at Tobruk. That was critically important. I think skill with weapons, that there's several testimonies from the Germans of the fine shooting by Australians against them. If you tried to look through a loophole, you'd be hit, sort of thing. And as soon as periscopes went up, they'd be shot off. So that would be another one. I should mention that the Australians felt that the British artillery was immensely important to their success. So I'm not sure if that's exactly a lesson, but that was a big part of it, realising the value of artillery. Making do is one of the things. I mean, just having to put up with incredibly difficult conditions and that wartime catch cry, we can take it, that was not exemplified better anywhere than Tobruk, having to put up with terrible, the heat, the flies, really poor food, constant danger. There were more than 1,000 air raids on Tobruk, and after April 25, there were no British aircraft, or certainly not fighters, in Tobruk. So dealing with not having air cover was another important lesson.
And they had a slightly less disciplined approach, the Australian units, than the British. It wasn't like they were left to their own devices. There was slightly more of a trust between the officers and the men, and a more relaxed environment. Do you think that helped them as well to build bonds? I mean, there were you do relate a couple of stories of officers kind of maybe keeping a bit too much of the odd bits of special food they got through and not sharing it. But generally, I think when I read British accounts, there is still that very Sandhurst parade ground attitude. The British kind of fall back on structure and discipline. The Australians don't work that. Do you think that was an advantage?
I do, and both British and Australian accounts of Tobruk mention that difference in the officer-men relationship between the two armies. So Alan Jones talked a lot about officers needing to prove themselves to the men, and that the men had their own ways of educating the officers. And sometimes events could do that, like the first officer in the 18th platoon, which these men were in, he occupied a house. There's not many buildings in Tobruk, but he occupied one, and then a shell landed near and threw him over inside that building. So he changed his mind and decided he needed to be with the men, which is exactly what they wanted. I think too, Paul, an important thing that emerges in Tobruk is that many men are capable of leadership there, and often, Australians are proud of taking the initiative. Probably unfairly saying the British didn't do that, but these sort of stories of privates and NCOs leading platoons, if need be, or taking over on a patrol if the officer or commander is hurt. There's just numerous stories of that happening.
That was one of my takeaways. There seemed to be an environment where individual ability would be rewarded quicker within a unit like the 9th Division than perhaps the similar British unit, where no matter how good you were, if you were just a private, you were seen just as a private or a lance jack or whatever it would be. But the Australian system seemed to reward attitude and improvisation at a lower level. And we've got another question from Ernest Manny there, who none of us know his real name, but whoever he is, he knows his stuff. He's a big popular person on my page, and he follows the We Have Ways pods as well. But does Mark think Morsehead felt more secure using the 9th Division as he did by having his old brigade, the 18th Brigade, with him as his ace up his sleeve? So does Morsehead think they are kind of one of his premier units?
Yeah, so that shows a lot of knowledge, that question. So the 18th Brigade was originally part of the 6th Division. It was one of the original units. They were then put into the 7th Division, but when they came into Tobruk, they were a bit separate from the 9th, and Morse used them as his reserve initially, and they were, I think he saw them as his crack troops. They were the best equipped, which was a really important part of it. And he had commanded the 18th Brigade initially before he became the 9th Division commander. So the answer to that very good question is yes, that must have given him confidence to have that unit with him. Although by the end of the siege, once they'd been there from April to October, all of the brigades, although the 18th left a bit earlier in August, all of the brigades were really veteran units.
Mm. And I think I'm glad you emphasized the aggressive patrolling there, because I think of the comics I read when I was a kid and the film Desert Rats and the Fighting Rats at Tobruk. There is a sense of kind of helplessness of the siege that is a false representation of them being kind of penned in, hemmed in, can't do anything, and they're only ever reacting to German and Italian advances towards them. But actually, as you make the point in the book and you made today, they're aggressively trying to take the war to the enemy, which doesn't really sit with the way I think most of us kind of perceive the siege of Tobruk. And I think you must agree it's important to convey that that they weren't holed up there just waiting for something else to happen. They were trying to very much to steer their own destiny and keep in the fight. And I guess that was important to get that across in your book.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning too that Morse, for all that we've praised him, he was actually aggressive in some ways that were very costly. Like most famously with the 2nd 43rd Battalion, he sent them in an attack on the 3rd of August, which was just a suicide attack, where he sent one company against an area with many machine guns, where there was, the adjutant of the battalion said basically there's no way this will succeed. One other thing too I should have mentioned, Paul, is that where the Australians excelled was fighting at night. These patrols, they weren't in the daylight, almost never. They were at night, and the Australians felt they had a distinct advantage over the Germans in night fighting. And that appears in other books, doesn't it, about the Germans? They weren't very willing to fight at night on other fronts, but Australians, when it came to Alamein, when they were going to do the advances at night, they were very comfortable with that, and the Tobruk experience was part of that.
Which kind of brings us to, we morph into the Alamein side of things as well, because it was the siege of Tobruk was very important, but it's El Alamein where things start changing and the campaign turns a bit. And there's a photo there with a Thompson submachine gun, so they do get the submachine guns eventually. Yes. But as we know that the North African and Mediterranean theatre is always kind of last on the list to get the new stuff, and so they're having to improvise, and it's that thing we've talked about before about Italian battles of we're actually learning from the enemy, and the Italians adopt things that the Australians and British are doing, and vice versa. And the Germans take ideas, and the French at Bir Hakeim take ideas from Italians and British. It's an odd theatre of sort of mutual respect for each other's improvements in combat techniques, and then trying to take those ideas and make them better yourself, and then and play to your strengths. And Australia's strengths, as you say, night fighting, patrolling, recognizing ability at a lower level, I think are all key to it. But let's move to El Alamein as well and talk about that.
Yeah, so as you say, this is a bigger battle in a strategic sense. It's more decisive in what happens in the war. It's a massive challenge for the 9th Division, because even though they're regarded as elite troops by both the Commonwealth and the Axis at the beginning of that campaign, a lot of parts of the 9th Division actually hadn't fought yet. Only one of the 3 field regiments had gone into Tobruk. There was a machine gun battalion attached to the unit which had not fought at Tobruk. Its anti-tank regiment hadn't fought. So all these units had not been blooded. And the other thing, which a point that's made by one of the 3 guys, is that the Australians hadn't been involved in set piece attacks really before. So this was the first time that was going to be tested. And as it happens, they turned out to be very good at that, although they had some defeats as well.
Yeah, and the terrain is similar to Tobruk, but as we know from that battle you mentioned about the attack that was hopeless in the desert, with the vision, with the ability to see for miles, attacks can unravel very, very quickly, and a day can suddenly turn very, very badly for either side because of the nature of the warfare there. So there's some amazing photos of just the terrain there, and we talk about terrain so often. And there we were with Philip Bradley talking about New Guinea last night, and we'll talk about New Guinea later on in this show. But they're having to adapt to a lot of different terrains as well, but because that's that typical thing we know from the Normandy campaign. There's some of the units that had fought to great success in North Africa, the 7th Armored Division, they go to Normandy and everything's different, and they don't do as well. The Australians, it seems to me, reading, I know they go back and they do jungle training in the case of this unit, but they do seem to adapt very well to each set of terrain. Is that an Australian thing? Because you do have within your country lots of different terrain within us. I know these men are predominantly from the South Australia, but what do you? I might a takeaway I had was the Australians do seem to adapt to terrain better than perhaps British troops. Is that something you agree with?
I think that in the desert they certainly adapted well. There is some desert in South Australia, in the northern part of it. The heat, of course, is the thing that they were pretty comfortable with, although there wasn't much shade in some places they fought. But, some Australian units got lost too. There was some fighting in July 1942, 1st Alamein, where Australians thought they'd captured a ridge they were supposed to, but they hadn't. They were on the wrong ridge. And this happened to the British as well. That's just an occupational hazard of fighting in the desert, clearly.
Yeah, no, definitely. And these are some great photos you supply of the kit and stuff they're finding. And again, with the accounts you had, it's all very well having great accounts. You do need some illustrations and photos as well. And, Philip Bradley was saying and Carl James was saying about how that there was a lack of correspondence with some of the Australian units in the later part of the Pacific campaign. I suppose because of Tobruk, there was some interest in the 9th there. They, as you said, they were regarded as being elite. So they did crop up in journals of the time and War Illustrated and pictorial things like that. So that must have helped to have some sort of photographic record as well. And how did the men deal with this a bit of attention they got there because of Tobruk? Because if the press start coming in writing about you, does that put more pressure on you because you're perceived then as heroes or the best, or being labeled as an elite unit it comes with its own responsibilities, I guess?
Yeah. I think a big problem for the 9th Division was that when other Australians, the 6th and 7th Divisions, returned to Australia, the 9th was left behind to keep fighting, and that might have had something to do with the reputation they developed at Tobruk. And that actually created some real problems for them with their people at home, women in particular, writing to them and saying, why haven't you come back like the rest of you? Volunteered to stay, which was the implication in some cases. I'm not sure that they were too worried about their reputation causing problems. That they were proud of it. Some other people resented it back in Australia, some other units, but I don't think it was a major problem. There's a lot of mutual respect amongst the different parts of the army. That's a fascinating photo there, Paul, of it's either a 50 or 75 millimeter pack gun. I put that one in the book, not only because it's a rare sort of photo, but also because it was that type of gun that the battalion in which these three men were members, the 2nd 43rd Battalion, it was the first Australian unit to fight at Alamein, which they did on the 7th of July, 1942, and they captured, actually destroyed 4 of these guns. So it really got the attention of the whole of the 8th Army, this sort of stunning attack that had been launched by Don Company, the company that's the focus of this book.
And how did Montgomery figure into this? Because every Australian guest I've had this week, we talked about the Pacific, and MacArthur comes up, and I know MacArthur will come up later on, and everyone has an opinion about MacArthur. But and I know from my experience, every American has an opinion about Montgomery, and so do Brits as well. How do the Australians feel about, and particularly the 3 men you write about some of these figures towards the top there? Did they admire the British leadership? Did they wish there was more Australian involvement? Some of the figures involved in the North African campaign, what are their feelings about them?
They don't say much about Auchinleck. Wavell, I think, was highly respected. even though he expressed some pretty negative viewpoints about Australian discipline, as did some other commanders. But Montgomery is really interesting because he had a special relationship with the Australians, and a lot of the viewers probably would have seen photographs of Montgomery wearing an Australian slouch hat. And when he first arrived in the desert in August 42, the first thing he did pretty much was to go out to the front line, and the Australians were on the coast road, the sort of on the right of the line, and he borrowed he was given a slouch hat by one of those soldiers, and he said, "I'm an honorary Australian." His father had been the Bishop of Tasmania, and the Australians really respected him, and that might be unusual in some ways, but that certainly was the case, and they admired the fact that he tried to minimize losses. That there's a lot of American historians, I believe, critical of Montgomery for his supposedly excessive caution, but the Australians had a lot of good words for him, and very importantly too, from the Australian point of view, Montgomery afterwards acknowledged the Australians had been crucial to the British victory at Alamein, and he wrote in the 1970s, we couldn't have won that battle without the 9th Division, and shortly before he died, he said he wanted to go to Australia to thank those veterans. So that was really wonderful.
And it's always good just to hear some positivity about Montgomery. I always find he was a difficult person to like as an individual, not that I've ever met him or anything, but as a commander, I feel he's been rather unfairly criticized. And this period of North Africa was one where he definitely was taking time to thank and recognize the units below him, something that perhaps later in the war he was taking a little bit more on his ego and being me. But I think in North Africa he was more we, and I think that was to his credit there. Later on things change a bit, but in your terms of these three figures, how did Gordon, Allen, and John come out of the North African campaign? What were their improvements and summing up of the experience of fighting in that theatre?
So by the end of it, Gordon Coombe was a lieutenant, John Lovegrove was a sergeant, and Alan Jones was a corporal. But both Gordon and John were wounded at Alamein quite seriously. So they both came back, but Gordon was wounded in the face in the July fighting, hit by a shell fragment, and he had to have some reconstruction done on his face as a result. John was wounded in that action I told you about, that one where he gave me that thrilling account. A stick grenade landed, he said, within a yard of him, and he didn't realize that the blast had affected him. He knew it killed the guy who'd thrown it, but he turned out to have quite a serious leg wound. Alan survived the battle, but he was involved in the climactic day, which was the 1st of November at a place called the Blockhouse, which you had up in a picture earlier. It's a sort of a railway ganger's hut. That was it. That one there, you can just see the building in the distance. It was a railway ganger's hut right next to the railway line, and it was used as a medical post, first by the Germans and then by the Aussies, who captured the post and kept the Germans working on there. So it was a sort of international place with a Red Cross flying over. But Alan and the rest of his battalion were in that area that you could see in the foreground of that photo, which they called the Saucer, which was under huge fire all through the day, which Rommel desperately tried to capture unsuccessfully on the 1st of November. And that was a sort of prelude to Supercharge, which occurred that night, and which Supercharge was really made possible by the fact that most of the German forces were up in the north fighting the Australians, and of course, the British armour and the New Zealanders attacked further south in Supercharge.
And the people enjoying the show, by the way, lots of nice comments in the sidebar there. But that portrait there, I think, is a great one of what us Brits and Americans think of when we think of the digger in North Africa. And people have said in the sidebar how refreshing it is actually that you're not saying that every single Australian is a tough digger. And because I talk a lot about the comics I read as a kid, and Australian soldiers were always bronzed, tough, muscled, seem to have no emotions except being tough and things. And what it's so important, we talked about it, to get across, it was a steep learning curve, and some of these men didn't take to combat immediately brilliantly. It was an evolution of how to work together as a team, and they're just the same as everybody else. They're civilians becoming soldiers, and it's important to kind of, as great as it is to have these being perceived as being brilliant. I had Tim Garung on a Gurkha a few weeks or months ago now talking about the Gurkhas. He said how the reputation of the Gurkhas is both a blessing and it's also a weakness, because it means that they're all perceived as being exactly the same, and they're all little brave men who will stab you first. And he said there's a whole range of people who join the Gurkhas with different types of attitude and processes about the war. And I think a balanced view of the Australian soldier, I think, is important, and that's the same what your book does there. Any other takeaways from the North Africa campaign before we move on to New Guinea?
I think it's interesting. That photo is from a Gaza airstrip where there was a gathering of the whole division, a parade of the whole division, and they were addressed by Harold Alexander and Field Marshal Alexander at the time, I think, certainly later. But that's interesting, Paul, in that that's the first time the division had actually gathered as a whole. So they learnt a huge amount from Alamein, but then, of course, they weren't able to use the lessons that they learnt there of large-scale warfare, and it was a major... it's been said that it was a problem for the morale of the 9th Division, that they went from a situation where they were fighting against hundreds of artillery pieces, one of the epic battles of the war, to situations where just one artillery piece would be surprising to come up against.
Which brings us to New Guinea, and we're echoing what both Carl and Philip and Michael have said, and we don't want to go through the whole thing about we can mention it a little bit, but as the war goes on in the Pacific, MacArthur kind of sidelined Australian units, and we could definitely find examples of units that have got very, very good at one type of combat, then being taken out of that theatre and thrust into another one where a different combat. And perhaps we can look at it now and say, why didn't they keep some of these units that were getting good at one thing in an environment where they could continue that journey of being good at that one thing? But that's, I guess, military logic, and military logic has always been a contradiction in terms. But we don't, the New Guinea campaign, for those who are watching, if you haven't picked up on what was going on for Australians, watch the show with Philip Bradley from yesterday, the show with Carl James yesterday. It'll explain a lot about what was going on in that area there, the Solomons, New Guinea, and that area between Australia and the Philippines. But how does Don Company get into the theatre? They've done El Alamein, but there's a gap. They back to Australia for jungle training. So what was the logic of taking them out of the European theatre into the Pacific?
Well, it's all about politics. It's not just the military. It's government saying we need them back here, and that was part of the deal when the 9th Division stayed, that they'd be able to return at the end of 1942. It's interesting, actually, Paul, during the battle, the Australian government at some points was saying we want the 9th Division back, when there was fighting going on, which was very unrealistic. But they were needed by MacArthur, even though later, as you say, the Australians were sidelined. In 1943, they were the best troops he had in the Southwest Pacific. And so the 7th and 9th Divisions were the spearhead of his campaign in the Huon Peninsula to try to get air bases to attack New Britain, where the great base of Rabaul was located. So, the Australians had campaigns that were still strategically important, and Don Company was involved in the landing at Lae, which was a major air base used by the Japanese in September 1943, a very large amphibious invasion, the largest Australian one since Gallipoli. And then they fought, they made another landing at a place called Finschhafen, and the fighting there was absolutely fierce. I think some of the most interesting parts of the book are about the fighting there. That's typical of the conditions. Every veteran that you meet, there's not so many left now, every veteran you meet in New Guinea got malaria while he was in New Guinea, and terribly debilitating, and other diseases like dengue fever. So everyone got sick in the course of that campaign. The Japanese were a fearsome enemy. They didn't take prisoners. They fought to the death. Although it's interesting, in the Lae campaign, the 9th Division, they'd been led to believe that the Japanese were just a fearsome enemy, and they retreated without really putting up a very strong fight at Lae. But at Finschhafen, it became quite different. And as I said earlier, a lot of stories in the book of soldiers who couldn't go on, and it's at Finschhafen where some of the really striking ones occur, like officers suddenly falling on the ground in tears and saying, I can't go on. Men coming up to officers in tears and saying, I can't go into this battle. I'm just not able to do it. So that's really quite striking to me.
And interesting to mention this quote there from Lovegrove there, because it's a different theatre. The responsibilities of leadership are very different. The nature of warfare is very different. Some of these men have now been at it for a couple of years. As we said, they're hitting their walls at different points and what have you. And it's completely different environment. And Philip Bradley took us through the stages of the Ley campaign yesterday, and as did Carl James in Bougainville, and moving up and endless landings and endless river crossings, dealing with the disease and the malaria and the heat and the clothes on your back rotting off you and things like that. Yeah. So this is where, when we think of leadership, we tend to think of leadership in that sense of, come on, men, let's go and storm the enemy machine gun, the Dick Winters at Brecourt Manor kind of situation. But actually what wins a war is that leadership to keep things going when you're not actually facing enemy. Because I think if you're a man in combat, the moments you're facing enemy are in some ways not the easiest, but they're the most, it's instinctive and you're using a training. It's the in-between time. It's dealing with just the misery of of river crossings and being wet all the time. And that's, I think, where leaders prove their mettle. If we're going to use the Band of Brothers connection again, it's in the Bastion, in the siege, when they're seeing their friends being killed and there's a lack of food and they're freezing cold. That's when leadership shines, not in those kind of set piece maneuvers. So John and Alan and Gordon, as New Guinea comes along, how are they recognizing the needs of leadership changing? What are now their priorities compared to perhaps the North African campaign?
I think all of them lead by example. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, both John and Gordon get wounded in New Guinea, and Gordon in amazing circumstances where a company, which is actually commanded by Gordon's friend Eric, whom I mentioned before, who was criticized by one of the other guys, that company is surrounded by the Japanese, and the battalion tries repeatedly to break through the cordon that's surrounding the Japanese. And there's one sort of frontal attack that's an absolute failure. And then Gordon, who's now in charge of Don Company, is ordered to attack across the same ground the next day. So it's a sort of Somme-like scenario, I guess, where you have to follow the wave that's failed. And he led the men. A bullet struck his Owen submachine gun, an Australian-designed weapon, and went into his chest, but he kept going. He kept going through this action where they took terrible losses again. It failed again. So that was, as I say, was a case of leadership by example. John Lovegrove too, there was a big Japanese counterattack towards a dressing station, and he took a leading role in holding off this Japanese attack. And when he was wounded, Alan, as I mentioned earlier, used the 2-inch mortar and took over the platoon, even though he was only a corporal, and played a key role in stopping this Japanese attack. So all of them used their experience of command and dealing with other people. Alan, for example, had to deal with a man coming up to him in tears and saying, I can't go into this battle. And Alan had to persuade him to stay. For a man in his 20s, that's not easy.
Yeah, and again, we're not here to necessarily summarize the entire campaign. We're here to talk about some of the individuals and the people involved there. And with the PowerPoint you sent me, we're gonna perhaps conclude now. We're looking at some of the individual actions and some of the people you write about, and go back to Gordon, Allen, and what have you. So I want to go back to this to North Africa, El Alamein and Gordon Combe, and the Luger pistol, because that's an extraordinary story. We're going to go through some of the war diaries and accounts there. So now's the time to sort of tell us about some of these men and the notable actions they went through. So this is an exhibit at the Australian War Memorial. So tell us the story behind that.
Yeah, so Gordon Combe was involved in this attack that I mentioned to you earlier, where they destroyed the anti-tank guns. And at one part of the attack, a young German put his arms around Gordon's legs, begging for his life. And, Gordon says in the letter he wrote to his wife, there was no way I could kill that man in that circumstance. And the young soldier gave his Luger to Gordon, and then went off into captivity. So what a great exhibit, a story of real humanity associated with that one. And of course, the Luger is there was an article actually written in a British magazine, I think it was called Parade, about the Australians, and said the war aims of the Australians are very simple. A pair of binoculars, Zeiss binoculars, and a Luger. As if that's all Australians wanted. And there's a Luger, but with an interesting story attached.
Another figure that pops up, Thomas, Lieutenant Thomas there.
Yes.
And so tell us about him.
So he was someone highly respected by the three main protagonists of the story. Won a military cross in that action where John got wounded by the stick grenade. But he kept a diary that's just amazing, where he says, I'm really scared. I don't want to go into this action. Just page after page of that sort of brutally frank stuff about his own anxiety going into battle. And some of it seems to be written while the fighting's going on, saying the tanks aren't separating themselves out from the men. They're drawing the crabs and this sort of thing. And so it's like stream of consciousness. And I was just so grateful to get this diary and to see that this guy, he was heroic in his actions, but he was just suffering all the way through. He was badly wounded at Alamein, the same action where John was, and that finished his war. And after the war, he was a farmer. He had to use a modified tractor and car to do his job.
And I think we've all been given this idea that the people who struggle in combat are kind of the exceptions to the rule, and most people go through things perfect. And I think the opposite is true. I think it's just, because killing other people is not a natural thing to do. These are doing things against human nature. And I think from the veterans I've met, 1,500 Normandy veterans over the years, wherever it's been, is that when they tell you that they all say we were all scared all the time, and anyone who says they weren't scared is a liar. But that kind of honesty tended to come out much later. When we talk about these early classic works written in the 50s and 60s, particularly the British and Australian, Canadian account, it's very stiff upper lip. It's very, no one showing any emotions. It's all just routine, and everybody's a hero, and everybody's able to do their jobs brilliantly. And your book highlights the fact that it isn't easy for any of these people. And some of the guys who can earn a medal late in the day, at the beginning of the day, as you say there, in Thomas's case, he was petrified. He was worried about it. They are worried about being killed. They are worried about whether they're going to do their jobs. And that's so important to be reminded of that basic fear these men have there. And again, you were so lucky to receive these accounts there, because that's the sort of, that painting there is the sort of the perception, isn't it? It's a great painting, and we have those wonderful ones, Terence Cuneo's ones back in the 60s and 70s of the Canadians at Ortoda and things like that. They're brilliant, and they stir the imagination. It's the paperback pulp novel kind of, but I don't know that kind of thing is really representative of what I know. These things happen, but it doesn't replicate the state of mind, does it?
No, it's an epic painting. It was painted by Ivor Heel, a painter who actually was in the 2nd 48th Battalion, a sister battalion of the 2nd 43rd, and the main protagonist in it was actually, it's based on a real person, but it's certainly sort of glorified. I wonder, Paul, if you'd mind going back to that slide you had with just the page, like the extract from a diary. I thought I might mention that this was a case where the lady whom I approached, the daughter of Lindsay Thomas, said he never talked to us much about the war, which is a classic sort of fit in with something you were saying a minute ago. And she said, I don't think his diary would be that interesting to you, but it's an amazing diary. I don't know how much of it people can see there, but I've rarely seen anything so frank about the brutality of what's going on. And he talks at the bottom there, I'm afraid of getting a wound, and so on. Another worst day I've ever spent, and so on. So if only more soldiers had diaries like that we could read.
Yeah, and particularly the British and Australian Canadians. I think Americans maybe naturally had a bit more honesty and more emotional interest, and Stephen Ambrose brilliantly was able to get people to kind of admit their frailties. But the British and Australian Canadian way was stiff upper lip for a long time, and there are some of those war diaries you read that they're just very dry, and you think this isn't really this is not placing me there. It's giving me information about how the battle was fought, but it's not placing me there with these people, and I think that's what's so important about this. But there's George Luff. We mentioned him at the beginning as well, so he's another figure there who went on to great success. And what was his experience of the war? What kind of leader was he, and how did the men perceive him?
So like Gordon, he'd been to the OCTU in the Middle East, which he'd initially resented the British methods at, but came to really admire the British. And his first action was in New Guinea, and he was a platoon commander. So, and on his first day of action, the company commander was wounded, so he had to take over. And he tells a story in there, I'm not sure if I've got it on a slide, where when people used to ask him, you're a very brainy guy to have gone into the infantry. And he said, on that occasion when I had to take over the company, I didn't feel any excess of brain power. You know, the pressure of that situation must have been enormous. And then later, he was the officer who I sort of mentioned in passing earlier, who saw an officer next to him just collapse on the ground and say, I can't go on. I can't do this attack we've been ordered to do. That was the company commander. So again, Lush had to take over a company and lead an attack. And he talks just very frankly, again, of soldiers not able to go on, arguments between officers and the commanding officer. Now, don't think that this means that unit was not effective. It actually had the second most decorations of any Australian battalion in the Second World War. So we're not talking about a unit that was, underperforming.
I mean, that exactly was, I was going to make that point at some point, is that just the fact that there are these frailties within a company, the fact there are strains on leadership, there are people, doesn't mean say that they're not achieving everything. And it's that idea of the length of service some of these people have been in, and that okay, by the end of the war, there weren't many of the originals left, but everyone had done a long time. And no matter how good you are, as people have said, military sort of psychologists and medical people have studied that no matter how good you are, after a certain number of weeks at the sharp end, you just fail to function at your best because you need a break. And this is highlighting for those Americans who are watching, the British and Australians and Canadians didn't have the strength in depth to just rotate units in and out. We didn't have it at the beginning of the war. We didn't have it by the end of the war. As we know full well, the American military by kind of mid-war can rotate units, and they're able to replenish and reinforce and give people breaks. And the size of our populations, we just were never able to do that. The losses would incurred, and so we had to leave these men in there, and they knew that, and they had to find their way to somehow deal with it and move on. And another great quote from Lash.
Yeah, that's the one I was mentioning earlier, where he said, I wasn't conscious of untapped reserves of intellectual ability when suddenly he had to take over the battalion. And another thing to mention there, Paul, to add to what you're saying about the reinforcement problems, is everyone was sick. That makes it hard for people to go on as well, sick with tropical illness.
Yeah.
And this guy's a bit of a hero of the book. He is an early commander of Don Company, which features in the book. And by the end of the story, he is the commander of the whole battalion. And, as that pose suggests, he was a pretty heroic figure. The men all looked up to him, sort of softly spoken, but very determined and good at getting people to follow orders against their will in a lot of cases, or getting people to help. And a man of real compassion too. He's a prime mover at the end of the war when they have a sort of carnival for the local children in Borneo who've really suffered under the Japanese. So he comes across as just a man of great integrity and someone who's risen through the ranks, as I say, through merit.
Yeah. And another great quote there. And again, you said that point about that we get to know these people in the course of the book, and we understand that their journey from recruit or novice to expert was not a neat line. There were peaks and troughs. There were difficulties and hurdles to overcome. And I was constantly, as much as I enjoyed reading it, reminded that it was a difficult journey for these people, mentally, physically, and extraordinary to understand.
And quick, they're doing these things over a couple of years, and they're in their 20s. They had to become so mature, dealing with the deaths of their men and writing to relatives and so on. What a challenge!
Yeah.
So that's just the sort of frontispiece of an article about that 7th July raid written by MRJ, which is Merv Jeans, the guy whose photo we've just seen. He led that raid.
Another question from Ernest Malley there. Does Mark agree with the often made claim that the army that went to Borneo was a new army? Was the Don company that participated in the Obo operations of 1945 a new company?
Yes, I can't remember the number. I wish I could. Who were actually veterans of Don Company who went into Borneo. I know in 18 Platoon, which is the one that Alan and John and Gordon were all in at one point, had no originals in it by 1945. So no one had gone from 1940 to 45. So there would have been probably a handful, probably fewer than 10 still in Don Company who'd been there since 1940. So it's partly wounds and deaths, but large numbers of people transferring out. So the battalion had about 2,700 men pass through it in the course of the war, when its war establishment was about 800.
And that's a perfect opportunity to answer Michael Nelson's question about, did the unit remain primarily in South Australia? Were the recruits coming from everywhere, where by the end of the war, was it still trying to bring people in from the same area?
Now, that's a great and important aspect of these battalions. So by the end of the war, there are a lot of people from other states. That was the case in every battalion. Most of them started just related to one state. So I mentioned in the book, the last person in the battalion was actually a Tasmanian when they sort of turned the lights out. And that was sort of typical. Many Western Australians as well. I think that was the state that had the second largest number going to that battalion. And they all got on remarkably well.
And there's a photo of Gordon and Eric Grant we talked about. And Eric Grant's journey in the book was, I think, the one that I took the most away from, because there were echoes of kind of the Buck Compton character in the Easy Company banner, but there's echoes of other figures we read about, these people that their journey is, again, I'm repeating myself, but not an easy one. And there's clearly good qualities there, but it takes a while to find them, and how they're perceived differently by different people around them. And even with this, within a company like Don Company, within the platoons, there's sort of rivalry and tension, and they're seeing their own commanders differently within a platoon as the company see them. And as they move in and out from units, it's a fascinating social study of how people behave and form these little bonds and dynamics. It's a case study of just human cooperation, I think.
An interesting thing about him too, Paul, is he wants a career in the regular army afterwards. And one of the commanders, a guy called Bob Joshua, was a remarkably brave officer. But when he was made commander of the unit, he was not very popular. And this started largely when he sent the men on a route march when a 12-mile march, when they first arrived in New Guinea, wearing gas masks for a large part of it. And several hundred men had to be treated afterwards. That was the beginning of a really rocky relationship between him and the battalion. And Grant made clear his dissatisfaction with Joshua in the course of the campaign, especially towards the end where that stress was happening that we were talking about a few minutes ago. And Grant was worried about how that might affect his career. And it's a complex scenario about sort of personal interaction and ambition.
Yeah.
This is Grant at the place I mentioned earlier called Javevening, where he was in charge of the company that was surrounded in this sort of epic defense for several days, fending off many Japanese attacks.
And another statue there that symbolizes something.
Yeah, so that I put that on the slideshow because it's by the sculptor Jaggers, who I believe he was British. He did the sculptures in the UK, aren't they, by him, I think, in this same style. Yeah. We have them in Australia at our Shrine of Remembrance in Melbourne, for example. And I put it there because Lush, in his book, mentioned that after Gordon was wounded, he saw Gordon Coombe with a bullet wound across his chest, talking to Joshua and explaining what had happened in the battle, pointing his rifle, I think, to a map. And he said he looked like a Jaggers statue, this huge, heroic sort of figure.
Brilliant stuff. And we'll just run through a few more of the people there. Captain Sanderson's another character that comes in.
Yeah, I mentioned that because he was an officer actually in another battalion, but at Alamein, there's a story where he went round his company before the night of Alamein, and afterwards he was in tears talking to his sergeant, saying, "We're going to lose a lot of these men tomorrow." And I just think that's a good story, showing the compassion that the best officers showed to their men. You know, they weren't so necessarily as concerned with their career as with their men. That's the ideal of leadership.
Absolutely.
This guy was also a Tasmanian. He commanded Don Company in its last campaign in Borneo, where again they got surrounded at one point, and at a place called Beaufort in British North Borneo, where he led the unit even after he was wounded. A bullet went through his calf, and so it was a fight in sort of thunderstorm conditions. I think it was 48 hours that they were holding out before the rest of the battalion could rescue them. And part of that action involved the only Victoria Cross the battalion got, where a Bren gunner knocked out 4 Japanese machine gun positions in trying to reach Don Company.
Amazing stuff. And there's his receiving the military cross there.
Yes. And I make the point there, this is actually from the book in the caption, that his wife said afterwards, you could see the strain of the war on him in that photograph. Age 35.
Yeah, it looks a lot older. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and he was one of the soldiers who, after the war, really struggled with noise, for example. You know, got a bit jumpy on hearing noises and so on, but then sort of came good and started to attend Remembrance Days and Anzac Days and so on.
And there's Jeans again. So by now the commanding officer.
Yes. So on Borneo. Doesn't look much different from the other guys, which is quite typical. Obviously, the officers would try to make themselves inconspicuous when there's snipers everywhere.
And a classic photo of an Owen submachine gun there that, and that typifies the Australian soldier there. And great photo.
Yeah. Yes, by that stage of the war, the Australians, when they came up against the Japanese, it was really a bit of a massacre. You know, the kill rates were sort of 7 Japanese dying or more for every Australian, and our superior equipment, air support, artillery support, tank support, just made a huge difference. Very different to Tobruk, as the Australians were aware. This is Jeans on the left with MacArthur and Morsehead. So MacArthur and Morsehead made a quick visit to Labuan, an island off Borneo, and came right up to the front where a couple of Japanese had just been killed. And the Australians were very impressed that MacArthur did that. You know, he had a bit of a reputation as Dugout Doug, who wouldn't go near the front, which we actually know is not true. But, yeah.
And we talked about MacArthur with Philip and Carl, and the idea of the Australians being sidelined somewhere. Now, for the 9th Division guys, Don Company particularly, they've been through some trials and tribulations where they have absolutely influenced the outcome of the war. The siege of the Tobruk and El Alamein, certainly absolute turning points. And so for some of those guys who've been through that, to be, I don't want to use the word relegated, but to them to kind of, and I don't even want to use the word mopping up, but it is what they were doing there was just this painstaking, just as we said earlier, river crossings and pushing on, and they aren't in the most important battle there. They have been sidelined. So how, as they're now getting to the point where they've honed their skills, they've worked out who the good leaders are, they've got all their experience there, what did it feel like for these guys to be put into an environment where you're not really able to show your proficiency because you've been sidelined?
Well, guys like Jeans and Gordon Coombe were sort of staggered that they had been sidelined from January 44 till June 45. That's a heck of a lot of time, isn't it, for one of your best formations? But they, and especially the young men who now largely made up the division or the battalion, they were really excited about going into action again. You know, it's what they were there for. And so although it didn't matter that much in itself, they were very professional in their approach to it. And this esprit de corps was part of that, you know, trying to maintain the reputation of the battalion, trying to prove to their mates that they were worthy of that tradition and that they would protect their mates and be courageous. So, yeah, they did as well as they could. And, you know, I think Gordon was as proud of the young guys he had in 1945 as he had been of those in 41.
And that's an important point to make, because you do talk about the integration of the newer guys coming in. That's another trope you get with these elite units, whether it's American paratroopers, British commandos, is that you're joining a unit that's reputation precedes you. In some cases, like in the American military, there's even a unit citation that you can wear, that you're wearing, but you haven't been in that action, but you're allowed to wear it anyway. So that brings that responsibility of living up to those who were ahead of you and those who've already gone back in coffins or have been wounded or invalided out. And so you phase through that transition, how these guys were just as keen to be part of it and earn their spurs, metaphorically speaking, even though, as you say, the war was perhaps not, or the campaign they're involved in wasn't changing the outcome compared to other events at the same time. And leadership, again, it all comes through to at this point there, those guys who have been there, they're now dealing with their own fatigue. They're veterans who are now wondering why they're there. The new kids coming in who want to do stuff. The war's coming to an end. And there's also that sense as well that the longer you put in camp in at the sharp end, the more you kind of resigned yourself. Well, half of my friends have been back dead now. Am I going to make it? Or is it just a matter of time until that bullet gets me? That sense of inevitable, the outcome is only going to go one way. So that's another aspect of leadership, to deal with that kind of knowing that your chance of coming through this alive are stripped down. So I know you do talks about leadership. So at this point in the New Guinea and Borneo, what are the keys of leadership then when you're one of these experienced NCOs or officers and are dealing with this mixture of people around you? How do you keep people motivated on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I think I don't think that issue of the value of the campaign is that important to the soldiers. And there's still, as we've said, the guys who are the frontline ones now are young fellows with maybe experience from one campaign in New Guinea. And that would have helped them largely because Borneo was a lot easier. Everyone who was in Borneo said that was easier, although Tarakan, another Night Division campaign, was very bloody. So officers like Gordon, as I say, is now the adjutant of the unit, and he's able to reassure his wife, it's a lot safer now for me to be in that position. And so there's new young officers coming through like that. Glover had been an NCO at Alamein where he'd been wounded, but he wanted to lead. Man, he was keen to do that. And the most recent book I've done is about a guy called Tom Derrick, who won the Victoria Cross in New Guinea. He was desperate to be an officer, and he had become a lieutenant before Tarakan, a campaign that was a waste strategically, but he was desperate to prove himself there.
Yeah, and we will sort of wind things down. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. Another thing that came up, Ernest Manning, a couple others made in the sidebar later, is those that had been promoted during the war from other ranks, if they wanted to take on a military career post-war, what were their opportunities like? Because that's maybe going to come back to haunt them, because the Australian military, as in my understanding, kind of went back to a rather rigid pre-war view of things, and kind of class came back in again. So as the war comes to an end, obviously there are some people who just want to go back home. They've done their bit. They want to just demob, go back home, marry the childhood sweetheart and go back to the farm. But there are others that maybe want to do something. So your book does touch on some of the sort of the transition to the civilian period there. But what particularly from the American and British viewers watching this, what were the kind of unique situations for Australians, particularly those that have been promoted from the ranks, if they wanted to pursue a career post-war? What were their opportunities, or what was working against them?
I think the first point to make is that not many wanted to do that. You know, they were very much citizen soldiers, and the argument was often made they were there to fight. The discipline was not that important to them. They wanted to get home as soon as they could. Quite a lot of soldiers, though, went off in a brigade-sized formation that went to Japan as the occupation force. And so that was a continuation of a career that then might go into the regular army, which was pretty small, although Australia then became involved in the Korean conflict. And there are a lot of World War II veterans there, including one of the most famous Australian soldiers, a guy called Reg Saunders, who was an Aborigine, our first Indigenous man who became an army officer.
And, you know, again, British people, we know that We go back to a new government because Churchill is voted out and Clement Attlee comes in, and we have the National Health Service come. America famously has the GI Bill, and people can get an education. For those who don't know the immediate sort of situation in Australia post-war, what were returning veterans, were they given helps to find jobs? What was the situation economically? Was there work? How easy was it for those who demobbed to transition, and what opportunities were they able to do, given Australia's role in the war? I mean, you weren't, apart from Darwin, you weren't bombed heavily, so your infrastructure was kind of still there. But give us a summary of what Australia was like in 45, 46 for the returning Men of Don Company.
Well, our economy had really been helped by the war, like the United States economy in a lot of ways. Women had been mobilized to an unprecedented degree, but they were basically expected to, and most of them wanted to give up their jobs. I hope that's a fair comment. And of course, the men returned to their jobs. There was some government assistance, not as organised, I don't think, as after the First World War, but I don't think there was a problem economically for the guys returning. It's more the eternal question, and one that's being studied more and more, is how well they could adjust psychologically.
Yeah. And you know, you covered their journeys. We've talked about that today, that some of them are struggling and things, and that's something that perhaps when your book was written, if I mean, even Stephen Ambrose's Band of Brothers was written in the 90s. That was our infancy of understanding PTSD, and some of the veterans who were written about in that, who I got to know, they only were able to articulate their feelings of what they'd been through and their struggles after the book, after the TV series, even, because then it got talked about more. So, you know, that is something that we are still understanding what these men went through. But to bring it back full circle to where we started, to understand the experience of the war through one company, I think you do get that all aspects of the human experience. I think we've done some brilliant shows on World War II TV where I'm thinking of David Stahl, the Australian or New Zealand actually story, he writes about Barbarossa. We were literally talking for the entire show about formations of millions. Wasn't much chance to talk about individuals during something as monumental as Operation Barbarossa. And as brilliant as that show was, understanding the people of the experience of people is important. So that is, I know, is key to your writing, to understand the experience there. So it's an odd question to end with, but do you think in terms of the importance of your book as a kind of a social study, is this book that I'm holding up again, is it one of your most important ones?
Well, I wrote it a few years ago and I've just reread it in the last few days. I'm very satisfied with it for several reasons, and one of them, and one I mentioned to you beforehand, is that it was designed as a tribute to three people who I just admired incredibly. And I think I said to my wife afterwards, I think they'd be happy with that. There'd be some things they'd possibly think they wish weren't in there, but I think they'd feel that it did them justice, and their beloved battalion, which was a great unit. You know, it had some flaws, but I always feel about writing about military history, I don't want to be one of those jingoistic writers who's just telling heroic stories, because if you tell the truth, there's a heroic element to it anyway. So I'm happy in that the warts and all story is still one that leaves you with a great feeling about these men.
Yeah, I would absolutely echo that. As someone who just finished reading it, it emphasizes the frailties and the difficulties that these human beings had in dealing with the situation, but it still underlines the objectives were seized, the campaigns were victorious, they did their job, they never failed, they never flinched, the unit did what it was supposed to do, but it was at the cost of the human damage. The human damage was real, even if sometimes the campaigns were successful. I think that's the takeaway from that. And I think as those people who are watching this, we come back to it again and again. We read about which aircraft type is better, which tank is better, and they're fascinating conversations. But really, our ability to discuss which aircraft was better is based on the fact that a generation of people, and this is important to say on November 11th for me here now, on a day in an experience that changed them forever, and it was a very, very difficult ordeal for them. And your book reminds us of that emotional and hurdle these guys had to went through. So it's been absolutely extraordinary talking to you, Mark. And we were talking, and I was thinking, I'll have to have you come back at some point and talk about maybe Tobruk or maybe Al Alamein more as a kind of a battle stand. Because next year, when we get into 2022, I want to acknowledge some of the 80th anniversary of some of the events of 42. So maybe I'm going to be doing an Al Alamein week in October or November next week. So I'm going to invite you now. So you have to say yes on camera. Would you like to come back and talk about Don Company, perhaps Al Alamein, and go through it, kind of day by day in a kind of a more military context? What we've done today is sort of sow the seeds of the people involved and that carried. But we'd like to come back and do that next year.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Paul. It's been really enjoyable, and thank you to the listeners too who've made comments.
Brilliant. And again, it'll get lots more views of the day as the hours and days pass. So I'm just going to remind people what we're coming up, and I'll come and say goodbye to you in a second. So, folks, we've got one more show in Australia in World War II, which is tomorrow morning, my time in France. Nicole Townsend is coming on talking about the Australians in the Mediterranean. So, an overview of the experience of Australian units out in the Mediterranean. The clue is in the title there. And then next week, I haven't put the shows on YouTube yet. I'm going to do that in the next few hours. We've got a variety. So next week's one of those random weeks again, just kind of a variety of shows I've been trying to fit in for a while. We're going to be talking about US criminals in World War II. There's a Sol David's coming on to talk about his book about the SBS. I'll get those shows listed as soon as I can. And then beyond that, we have Aviation the Pacific Week coming up. We've got Pearl Harbor Week coming up in December, and then 3 weeks of programming about the Battle of the Bulge. So as usual, folks, don't forget to check out what we're doing on social media. I remind you again, the links to purchase Mark's books are in the description below, as is the link to his website. Check out our links to Patreon, check out our social media links, and I will see you all again tomorrow to talk with Nicole Townsend. But right now, thank you very much, Mark, for joining us. And I have to say, I sincerely mean that. I read a lot of books for this channel, and I enjoy all of them, but yours has been one of the best I've read in the last few weeks and months. It just really, really gripped me, and it was the human element that really, really will stay with me. So thank you very much for writing, and thank you very much for sharing some of these experiences with our audience. It's been very much appreciated.
Thanks very much for having me on the show, Paul. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So, everybody, I will see you all again tomorrow. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your day. I'm off to go and do a walk around the cemetery in Bayeux and pay my respects. Thank you very much. Cheers. See you all tomorrow.